Let's look at the theoretical perspectives on aging. So we are going to see how we can understand the process of aging and how aging of individuals impacts the society, and how we can sort of make sense of what changes and what consequences or impacts this process has. Because, as mentioned, this is a part of the natural process, and it involves all individuals in society, so it is an important part of social life. And we're going to look at through the lens of functionalist perspective, conflict theory perspective, and symbolic interactionism perspective, which we have been talking about through this course. However, in this chapter, you'll find that there are a few theories under each of these perspectives that you are going to be reading about, and I will be going over them on the slides. This is because there are many views that have tried to make sense of the process of aging and how that shapes or reshapes individuals, and how those sort of changes impacts society, both in terms of social life and also economics and among other fields. So we're going to look at them. So there are a few sub-theories under each of the three main theoretical perspectives. You don't need to know more than what is explained in the textbook, and I'm going to go over them. As long as you know what each of these theories try to explain and to which perspective they belong to, you'll be fine for the exam purpose. Let's start by the functionalist perspective. As you remember, the functionalist perspective is focused on explaining the function of different social phenomena in society, and is concerned with how the different parts of society, through their natural evolution, fall into the right places to ultimately keep society's order, and how that progresses with time. And so any social phenomena and any social problem that rises or is faced is part of society's natural evolution, and there's a function to it because there has to be, and they're focused on those aspects. And we're going to see that we're going to see some of those main elements in the three theories that are subsectioned under functionalist perspective, which is disengagement theory, activity theory, and continuity theory, which are trying to explain what aging process and how aged individuals impact society. In terms of the disengagement theory is really focused on explaining how, as individuals age, they naturally withdraw from society and individuals, and they find this as a function that happens naturally as the society and people in the society evolve and grow. And they think that, sort of in disengagement theory, the assumption is that all seniors universally go through this phase when they grow older. They withdraw from society and social relationships and become, sort of like more focused on their personal lives. And because once they withdraw from others in the society, they find more time and liberty within their private lives to sort of do what they want. So they try to explain the changes that happen with as individuals grow older through this process of withdrawal, which they see as naturally as a natural act of and part of growing old. So again, if you think about what this theory is trying to say about the mature stage of individuals' life, where they're growing older and they're growing into elders and seniors, it is telling us that there's no concern here. People naturally withdraw from society and individual relationships, and the only thing is that because men and women have different life experiences, they may experience social withdrawal differently. But as soon as they get as soon as they find another role that they can find compatibility with and they can take, they'll be fine. So it leaves little room for concern, because it's deeming these sort of withdrawal and whatever changes that's happening in seniority as a natural part of life. And as you can guess, this is a generalizing sort of view towards aging, and the criticism have been focused, criticisms of disengagement theory have been also focused on that, not every senior around the world experiences withdrawal or experiences growing older the same way. So disengagement theory has been criticized by that, even within functionalist theorists. And activity theory talks about how, the more individuals are resourceful and are able and active to be able to get new roles or find new ways to live, the happier that they will be during their life. So although these are functionalists, in activity theory, the concern that activity and opportunities for people to take so that they don't withdraw, that it's not available to everyone equally, has been addressed within activity theory. But activity theory is also talking about they're talking about the distinction between why some individuals may experience aging differently, because they're saying the more active and involved an elderly person is, the happier he or she will be. But still, they're talking about the stage of growing older as a stage in which is natural, that it happens, and that and the concern here is just about individuals who are now like elderly individuals have the means to find activities and opportunities that they can take on so that they can spend their seniority and aged phase of life. Continuity theory is different from activity theory, because in continuity theory, the focus is to explain that the elderly don't necessarily need to make a drastic or sudden change in their lifestyle, because as I explained in activity theory, the concern is that the more people have opportunities or ability to take on different roles, the happier they will be. And in disengagement theory, the concern is that as long as people withdraw, but they're going to find something to do with their life, because in their private life. But in continuity theory, people are saying that the focus is that there doesn't need to be a drastic change in life. Like seniors don't need to necessarily take on a new role or a new hobby or like new way of lifestyle to be able to find happiness or to be able to spend their later years. But they just look for consistency, and they try to explore ways in which they can live in equilibrium and peacefulness. And as you can see, all these theories are just concerned with how life is spent in the later phases of life, and they're talking about how the changes in all of them share this idea that the changes in the later stages of life are natural, and the different concerns are about how people spend those years. And they don't talk about different other issues that, for example, diseases or or other challenges or other things that might be involved in the older age phase of life. The conflict theory perspective, as you remember, is focused on talks about power relations and differences between groups or classes, and also talks about social injustice and economic inequality between different groups of in the society. And it's the same way when it comes to aging, because when talking about the age population from conflict theory perspective, they view individuals who are elderly individuals and those who are seniors or senior individuals, being in sort of like a power dynamic relationship with the younger generations, which can differ based on their economic standing. In conflict theory, they talk about how elderly may struggle with other groups, for example, the younger society members. And they also talk about how financial resources will be the source of different experiences throughout seniority and for elderly people. So if you remember, like the functionalist, through the functionalist perspective, the concern was about, that this is the stage that was natural and etc., and that's how people are going to spend their lives, and that's just part of natural life. But in conflict theory perspective, aging is explained with attention to the power relations that may exist between the elderly and the younger groups or other groups in the society, in addition to talking about the financial resources that can impact how one experiences aging and seniority, and also talks about the economic impacts of aged populations over society. So that's pretty consistent with the main aspects of conflict theory that we have learned about and read about. So when it comes to modernization theory is really focused on talking about the power relations between the elderly and the younger generations, and it's talking about how the combination of industrialization and modernity brought about this context in which elderly who were not so up to date with the modern skills and modern lifestyles and etc. became had less power to groups, the younger generations who were more accustomed to the industrial society's skills and knowledges and culture and lifestyle. So modernization theory, modernization and industrialization, and those changes in social lifestyles are the reason why those differences between these two different groups of people, the elderly and the younger generations, becomes apparent. And it talks about how elderly lose power because now their skills and their life experiences are not so much relevant in the modern society, and that also they lose their quote unquote economic value because many of them may not be up to date to work in the workforce anymore, and etc. Well, now this is not true for everyone. Many individuals who are more senior are very knowledgeable about everything, but that's how this theory explains the changes that the impacts that aging and seniority creates over an individual's lives, and also its impact over the society as a whole. So there's a lot of discussion about how in pre-industrial societies it was different, the value of the elderly had more weight, and etc., and that this changed with modernization and so on. Age stratification theory under conflict theoretical perspective is where attention to discrimination and social injustice on the basis of age is paid attention to. So the discussions around how just like gender and race and class, age becomes a factor based on which individuals receive unequal access to opportunities, and unequal and unjust discrimination is discussed within stratification theory, and they talk about how age becomes a basis of social control within the different age groups, and how that alters access to social resources as well as economic power. So they talk about privilege and in stratification theory, and how that as individuals age and as they become more senior, these they become subject to this sort of discrimination and unequal treatment, which is not right. And because this is where discussions about discrimination and unjust treatment is spoken about, it's also there's also an analysis of how within societies that are stratified by age, there exists an age hierarchy based on which individuals are judged on. And so for example, what this age group should possess versus how you should act within your age, and things like that can ultimately lead to people being oppressed and discriminated against if they are quote unquote outside of the norm. So in stratification theory, we're combining the discussion on power relations, the power relations between different classes in the society, as well as social injustice and access to resources and opportunities. Feminist theory, as part of the conflict theoretical perspective, argues that older white male occupy more powerful role, and they are far less limited in choices, and also are far less exposed to discrimination and disadvantages that women face in their seniority in comparison to men. And it talks about how because of a historical access to power and social and economical opportunities, men end up in a better position when they age in comparison to women. So it takes gender as a key variable for analysis, as does feminist theory across all fields, and also talks about some other important experiences that women face that men may not necessarily face in the same way. It talks about how because women's status is traditionally more dependent on men, for women who become single or single heads of their families, or living without male figures becomes an issue for generations that when women were living in traditional families and now are in seniority, and they have to also struggle with decision-making powers. And also talks about how women enter retirement age with considerably less financial resources, again because of the historical access to political and economic power that men have. Consistent with what we have talked about symbolic interactionism perspective, or symbolic interactionist perspective, this perspective is focused on day-to-day interactions and how people create meaning out of their interactions. And so when it comes to aging and making sense of how aging impacts society, they again are focused on how through day-to-day interactions and everyday life and meaning making, people make people make meaning of seniority. How does that experience of being a senior is constructed through interactions, and they focus on the changes that are associated with the old age in and out of themselves, talking about how individuals face this sort of changes. So what is on an individual and day-to-day interaction level that makes seniority and the experience of elderly different, and how does it feel for individuals? And so because in symbolic interactions, and we want to understand how individuals actually experience seniority and what happens in their day-to-day lives, subculture of aging theory talks about how as individuals age, and like for the more senior individuals in the society, when they are excluded from society, what happens in their life is that they voluntarily or involuntarily, they sort of like become parts of shared communities, and they study how elderly would disengage from society and then develop new patterns of interaction with people who are about their age and share similar circumstances as them, and also have shared backgrounds and interests. So they're focusing on how as elderly are excluded, but how do they interact? How do they develop new patterns of interaction with peers who share backgrounds and interests and circumstances with them, and how do they make meaning of their seniority in that way? So based on this theory, being part of a community of peers, of people who share similar backgrounds and interests, is this way for elderly to make sense of their sort of like a later stage of life. How do they make sense of like having withdrawn from the rest of the society? How making sense of what it means to be an elderly, and how life looks like is it's all explained through looking at how they become parts of communities of peers, and how sort of like those interactions become their sort of like their day-to-day lives. The selective optimization with compensation theory might seem a little bit more complicated, but the main idea for you to take away is that in this theory, researchers are saying, researchers are focusing on saying that how individuals make sense of their, like their later stages of life, or when they are elderly and when they are more senior, is that, they sort of like make sense of that by balancing the losses they have had in life, and the balances that, balancing the losses associated with aging, so things that they may have lost as because they have grown older, with what they have gained in life, and what they have gained from this change. So it's talking about, it's sort of like a process in which the goals, which they're calling the compensations, are specific to the individual, and it is in this way, individuals sort of like, make sense of what is happening as gains. So it's sort of like talking about how, there are things that people lose as with age, such as physical strength. But, it's sort of like a process of thinking that the individual goes through, and they sort of like view the positive sides of what they have gained in order to make sense of, of the changes that, that the changes that being a senior or going into ages where you have, maybe sort of like where you don't have the same level of energy, or you don't have the same level of means to do the different activities that you wanted to do by losing those. But through this sort of like process, you balance those things that you have lost because of aging with things that you have gained. So in a way, it's seeing the silver lining in a way, and they're sort of like focusing on this process which they are calling selection, compensation, and optimization. You don't need to know that, because these theories you have to get like really sort of deeper into them to truly unpack what is meant. But that's for you to take away here would be that in this theory, aging is a process and not an outcome, and that it is focusing on the goals that are specific to the individuals. In a way that they're saying that yes, there are aspects of life that will be lost with aging, but individuals make sense of it by sort of like optimizing, by sort of like rethinking the sort of goals or the things that matter, and looking at what they have gained. So in a way, it's change of a mindset basically that results in different sort of interpretation and meaning making of aging. But for the purpose of this course, just knowing that this theory is talking about how sort of like individuals balance the changes in aging with outcomes that they set for themselves as individuals, that's enough, because this is a little bit more complicated. So we will just leave it at that. That within this theory, researchers are focused on talking about how individuals create new meanings of this newest stage of life by sort of like thinking in this way, by balancing things they have lost with things that they have gained. The Grierson transcendence theory is focused on talking about how the meaning of growing older, the meaning of becoming elderly, can be found in how people have gained wisdom and knowledge from the experiences of the life that they have spent. And it's sort of like focused on how people, as people age, they sort of like let go of the limited views they had on life in the past when they were younger, and because they grew older and they faced many challenges and many different life events, and they went through ups and downs, they now as older individuals have more wiser and more, maybe you can call it spiritual sort of like view towards life, a sort of view that is very it's very not only peaceful but also full of wisdom and understanding and etc. So symbolic interactionists here believe that with this phase of life, individuals sort of like are also like struggling to overcome their own failings and turning it into strength. So again, it is focused on how people who have entered later stages of life make sense of their life. Again, as mentioned in the beginning when I talked about symbolic interactionism, here the focus is on sort of like looking at the lens of how do individuals make sense of aging, how do they create meaning through interactions, and this is talking about how this having aged more maturely becomes sort of meaningful as individuals reflect on on the more comprehensive and more wisdomy view that they have over life and over different things. So, and the claim here is not that all older individuals are wise or or gurus or anything like that, but the focus here is that these changes do happen, and this is one way that you could look at how people, as people age, they sort of reflect on their life views, and also that it talks about how individuals must struggle to overcome their own failings and turn them into strength. The last theory under the symbolic interactionist perspective that is discussed very briefly in the chapter is criticized because it sort of like talks about it implies too much credit to material exchanges, and it's not so much focused on like the non-material meaning making, such as love and friendship within in how it explains the seniority and later stage of life. But the idea here in exchange theory is really talking about how individuals who how elderly and more senior individuals have to exchange sort of like something. So let's say exchange something with the other groups of age groups and other groups in society in order to be able to still participate in social life and etc. And it's claiming that it's a rational choice approach, meaning that so because as you age, you sort of like may become less desirable to maybe you may be seen as less desirable by some in the society to socially interact with. Then so that you would have